All right. Our next guest is Rob Roll.
Roll. How's it going, guys?
Good, man. How are you
Rama.
doing?
I'm good. I figured let's give the people what they want. I got to give a shout out to Dylan for inviting me here tonight. He's in the chat, I know, and also sent a super chat hoping to get me noticed to come on here with you guys.
We just didn't get to it yet. Okay, cool. Well, no problem, man. What's going on?
You can read it later. It's fine. So
I'll just bring it up
guys.
here.
Yeah. I was watching because Dylan sent this to me, and so I know there hasn't been a ton of atheists who have come on. I'll give you the 10-second background for me. Born and raised a Christian, but deep within you guys talked about the young earth creationism earlier. I was in the IFB Independent Baptist.
Oh, man.
I like
no wonder you became an atheist.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I've heard you guys chatting about this a bit here and there, newer to seeing the stuff, but it is, I think, really easy for people to go from that deep into just this one way of interpreting the Bible and then just start questioning everything. It usually starts with one thing, and for me it was Noah's Ark and the flood, and looking at some of the other evidence around that. But I don't want to go there for today because you guys talked about Genesis already. I thought, let's shift into the Gospels, and Mike had actually responded to one of my videos from the Faith in Question channel about the gospel anonymity. I don't necessarily want to talk about that today, but I was wondering if you guys, as you think about the Gospels and the historical accuracy of the Gospels and some of the things that we're all familiar with that just don't line up with the history that we see from other sources. I'm curious from your standpoints, I don't know if you guys put a percentage on it, but what is your level of confidence when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that you're actually reading something that you could point to and say is as historically accurate as any history book?
I'm gonna let Eric go because he hasn't gone for a while. So
the Bayes factor is top heavy. I'll just put it that way. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with. I would echo that statement. I'm not gonna put a hard number.
What problems? Is there a specific problem?
I mean, I have in mind. I think what I would probably point to, there's obviously a number of contradictions and errors and things along those lines. But if I look specifically at history, I think I always go to the birth narratives, and I would point to
talk about the census.
Yeah, the census. Obviously, there's challenges there around Caesar Augustus and Quirinius, right?
No, there's not really a challenge there. It's not. It's way overblown. And so, first of all, if you look at Luke 1:5. He knows that Jesus is born in the time of Herod. So any interpretation of the facts has to be in line with that. People are saying, no, he's got it 10 years wrong. He's got it 10 years wrong. No, he doesn't. If you also look at Acts 5:37, he knows about the census. And so any kind of interpretation we have to make is going to have to be in line with those facts. Now, usually what skeptics will say is that Luke is just kind of manufacturing a census. And let me know if you disagree. I don't want to strawman your position. In order to fulfill prophecy, in order to get Jesus to Bethlehem. Well, what a stupid way of going about that. That's incredibly that's like using a steamroller to crack a peanut. He doesn't even mention the Bethlehem birth census. Matthew does. Matthew mentions Micah 5:2. But Luke never even mentions it. So if he wanted to get Jesus born in Bethlehem, he could have done that in a much less heavy-handed way. And he could have at least made reference that this fulfills some sort of prophecy. Also, there's the fact that Luke is writing about something in an era where he could have easily been called out on something if he did make some sort of a historical blunder. Now, I'm not trying to make an argument from silence, but you think that we would see, I don't know, Celsus or even Julian the Apostate, who would have records, Roman records that could possibly even date back to that time. They never make a charge. This is a modern claim. about the census that is just based on I think, in my opinion, some goofy interpretation. I know
Do you think it's
people.
the same census as the historical census that we see Josephus writing about?
Well,
And it's just
censuses
like the dates are
take.
wrong?
We know that according to the deeds of the divine Augustus, that there was a census at around that time. We also know that censuses roll out over a long period of time. And so it was rolled out, if I remember correctly, and I'm going off of memory. So just if I'm making any sort of errors, just, let me know. I'd have to look it up. History is kind of hard when you're just going directly off
Yeah.
memory.
Mhm.
But it was, I think, around, I want to say 10 to 8 BC. And then it's not improbable to think that it took several years to roll out and get to that particular point. There's also overreading that a lot of skeptics do, like Dan McClellan, and say that like they're going all the way back to their ancestral home from thousands and thousands of years, and that's so highly and historically improbable. Well, that's overreading. They're just going back to their birth area.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah. Well, real quick, one last thing on
Yeah,
that.
go ahead.
And so I think that's an overreading. And then also people will say, well, there are no censuses like that where people require that. Well, actually, that's not even true. We see in Tacitus Annals, there's a Clite tribe that does that. We also have Gaius Vibius Maximus. We have a archaeological remains fragment that talks about a census where people had to go back to their ancestral homes. And so overall, and then we also have to make one last thing, and I'll stop. I don't want to gish gallop. We have to just assume that like Luke is constantly showing himself to be close up to the facts in many, many different ways. We can confirm him dozens of different ways in the book of Acts, including in his gospel. And then Josephus actually writes later. So it's also possible that Josephus made a mistake, and that's something that Mike has done a whole long video on like a few years ago. So there's just a lot of factors to take into consideration, and I've just a few.
I have heard, I believe most of those before, and I do think, like if I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's not possible that Josephus made a mistake, right?
Sure.
But I do think that we use a little bit of a double standard there when we throw out Josephus making a mistake as a strong possibility for explaining why the census is 10 years later, when we're also pointing to Josephus as one of the strongest sources we use to talk about why the rest of the Gospels are reliable.
Right. Well, I'm not necessarily. Josephus does make mistakes, though, in several places, and we can point to that. There's also the fact, I'm not saying it's 10 years later. It's not 10 years later. I'm just saying that it takes time. But the census
tells us the census is 6 CE, right?
No,
that's what Josephus says.
I'm saying Luke says that I'm saying censuses take time to roll out. And again, I'm going off memory, so I could be making a mistake here. And I could pull up.
Well, yeah, I guess if it takes time to roll out there. So Josephus is saying this census happened in 6 CE. For Luke's story to work, that census needs to occur somewhere between 4 and 6 BC, right? So 10 to 12 years earlier is the time frame necessary.
Yeah, let me pull up what I actually got on this here, so that I'm not just trying to remember.
And yeah, while you're doing that, I'll make another comment, because one of the things that I think is really interesting is when we do talk about this, yes, there are people who say that it's implausible that you'd have to go back to your birthplace. I guess I don't necessarily look at it from that standpoint. I look at it more of like, what is the purpose of a census in the first place, right? If you are Quirinius, if you're the governor of Syria, you do a census so that you can understand how many people live in that area, in specific areas. Why? Because you're ruling over these subjugated people. You need resources from Rome. You need soldiers. You need to I work in business. I'm sure you guys do as well. Like, there's ratios of things that we apply when we put our resources towards something to make sure that we've got things covered. So the utility of a census is still used today for that purpose. So that's where I start to struggle with, like, yeah, it's interesting information to see where are people actually from, but they say Joseph was of the line and lineage of David. That was 1,000 years, 1,000 years before Joseph lived. So what's the utility of that census if everyone has to go back to where their 1,000-year ancestors are from?
Well, I'm saying that it's not. I'm saying that's an actual overreading of the actual text. As far as
I'm not a scholar like you guys, so tell me what that means, an overreading of the text.
what I'm saying is that you're reading into it as like it's saying that you have to go all the way back to your ancestral home in order to,
because he's of the line and lineage of David.
Let me look at it real quick here.
I think it's Luke 2 that it actually.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up here. Yep. 1 second here.
What are you looking for?
Yeah, so Luke 2 verse 4.
It's Luke 2, 1 through 4.
Joseph, I'm still stuck on the KJV, guys. I'm sorry, I grew up IFB. I can't get off it. So Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. That was 1,000 years earlier.
So what's the issue with that exactly?
I'm talking about that in the context of utility for the census. How is that useful information to the government of Rome to know where someone came from 1,000 years ago if they're trying to use the census to deploy their resources?
I'm not really sure let's just say we don't have an answer to that. I'm not really sure that's going to be a point against the reliability of this account. Like just because something might be inscrutable doesn't mean that it's going to be a hit against its authenticity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say it's among the issues, right, for this account.
I mean, I might just say it's a non-issue. I don't know why we should think that not having an answer to that is an issue.
This is Craig Blomberg on this specific topic, right? And so he says that they all went to be enrolled, each in his own city. One could understand why verse 4, why readers outside the Roman Empire and familiar with the practices could imagine his claiming that every Jew anywhere in the empire who could trace his lineage back to David had to go to Bethlehem. But Luke doesn't say that. He says one's own town. And it's also elsewhere language for the city of one's birth or one's present past residence. You can see that in other places in the Bible, like Joshua 26, 1 Samuel 8:22, 28:3, 2 Samuel 19:37, Ezra 2:1, Nehemiah 7:6, Matthew 9:1, 13:57, and Mark 6:4. He goes on to say, only a small minority of Jews in the first century lived somewhere other than the city in which they were born, so they would only need to travel for the census. Most tried to return to Israel for at least some of the annual festivals, so that would be a natural time for them to be enrolled as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, I think it's just an overreading, and plus there is the fact that in Tacitus Annals 6:41-4, it does talk about the Clitae tribe in the Roman Client Kingdom of Cilicia, and they were made to conform to Roman customs by declaring their property and meeting tax obligations, including situations where people had to return to their places of origin for the census. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a Greek papyrus by Prefect Gaius Vibius Maximus instructing everyone under his rule in Egypt to head back to their hometowns as part of a census. And so you could speculate and go, well, there's this theological reason, and he's trying to connect him to David. But we already have Jesus connected to David, even in Paul's writings and even in these other places. And so it's like, I don't think this is like Luke being like, what would be this genius way of like really connecting this to David? I'm going to invent like a census contrary to the facts, or like really get it goofed up, like not even try to get my facts straight, to like prove that Joseph was even like of the line of David, when like the whole focus of his gospel is like that he's born to the Virgin Mary, and like his whole focus, like Joseph is less so, it's more of an afterthought than we see in Matthew's gospel. And so I just don't buy that theological kind of motivation there, like at all.
I mean, you can see why someone else might see that differently, though, right?
Yeah, I think it's weak.
Yeah, I was just gonna say. I mean, I don't know that we even have strong evidence. Like for you to say, "Hey, he invented this for some theological purpose." Well, why should I think that that's going to be the best explanation of the data when Eric and I are going to point to other places where it's more consistent with historical reportage with people that didn't feel the freedom to make up historical facts or change the historical facts for their theological purposes, right? Because like if they're going to make up something for the sake of theology here, why is it the fact that they're going to have embarrassing details in other places, or things that actually might not even line up with the expected theology? For instance, like again, people like to say that the Jews expected a conquering Messiah, an earthly Messiah, and then Jesus undercut all of this. So like, why is it that, well, yeah, that's probably historical what happened with Jesus, but then all of a sudden when we have something like this happening, we're going to say that they make up historical facts?
I mean, do the three of you believe that the Gospels are historical documents?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
If by historical well, it depends what you mean by the word historical document here.
Well,
too,
I
right?
mean,
Like,
if I read, you can read the Gospels a few different ways, right? But there is a very literal way of reading the Gospels that says, like, this is giving us a date, it's giving us places, it's giving us people. Did these things happen?
Yeah,
in this
yes,
time period,
because
with these
multiple
people in
times
these
we can,
locations?
because we can a ton of times cross-check and see that they're right.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so, like, if we looked at just like the census in isolation, and we didn't like fully even know how to explain it, we would understand that like ancient history can be kind of messy. But
Sure.
then there's all the times that we can confirm it. And so there's, I mean, I would even be willing to say, like, what if, like, there was another Quinctilius Varus, who was the governor of Syria at about 64 BC, during the time of the census, right? Maybe he could have mixed those two up. That would be like a minor good faith error on Luke's part, but it wouldn't like give you this like idea of like Luke is just making stuff up.
Yeah.
And that's just one option. I think there are options that are fully like,
But yeah, I think
that he didn't make a mistake.
you've pointed twice though to mistakes, and like this is one of the things that like where some of these arguments start to fall apart for me, because I hold the Bible to a different standard than I hold
That's
other
your
books.
yeah,
right?
that's your
And
view
I'll,
of
I'll
that would just that would challenge our view of inspiration or
yeah, but
inerrancy.
that's what my question is. It's like, what is your belief about God's involvement in these things being written down? Because
Well, I mean,
mistakes being
that's
made,
getting
problematic.
that's moving the subject
Yeah,
off of
I was gonna say.
historical reliability, though.
Yeah,
And so
that's well, no, because you're saying that there could be a mistake.
would that follow that
So if there's a mistake,
the
then it's not
but
historically reliable.
but
Hold on.
no. We don't do that with documents. We don't throw them out and say it's not
Well,
historically reliable.
I'm not saying the whole thing. I'm talking about this
Sure.
Well, Rob,
story.
Okay, but getting a story, like, just real quick, like mixing up Quirinius with Quinctilius Varus, who was the governor at that time, like that would be like saying, like, I wouldn't throw like you out as a historical source if, like, say I knew you and I knew that you were somebody who was trying to be accurate, you're trying to get the facts right, and you mixed up a name in good faith. I would just be like, well, he made a mistake, and actually, like, he was pretty close. He just mixed up a guy's name. Like, names are like some of the easiest things to get mixed up in everyday experience. I'm not even saying like that's the only explanation. There are multiple explanations that undercut the whole idea that Luke even made a mistake here, depending on how you read Luke 2:2 and different things with the word protos or hegemon and all that other kind of stuff. And so there's different ways of coming at this and looking at this. And then what I have to do is I have to take everything else that Luke tells me into consideration. And when I look at like somebody like, say, Colin Hemmer, and I see that during the parts in the book of Acts from that follow the life and doing of the Apostle Paul, that he's getting obscure detail after obscure detail after obscure detail correct over and over and over again. And then I see that he doesn't just do that like in the book of Acts, that I also see over and over and over again he's confirmed in history in other minute ways in the Gospels. Then because and then I look and I see, okay, well, there's like three possible explanations that aren't like really ad hoc or like super fishy in order to explain away the census. At that point, like, it would be really stupid for me to like throw out Luke, even if there was some kind of like a good faith mistake, like a simple name fix. And so I think I don't know how familiar you are with the case for Luke Acts and its like
Yeah.
reliability, but I would say it's probably one of the most defensible like historical writings that we have from the first century.
Yeah, I hope no one's
We
getting the
just
idea
really
that.
quick. We do have to move on pretty soon here,
Oh, you're
though.
fine. You're fine. Yeah, that's
Man, this is my favorite guy so far.
I know. I know. I'm just
I-
Matt's yelling at me saying we got
I
to move
know.
on, even though I want to keep it going.
Hey, listen, Matt.
I'll have to come back, and there's plenty
Definitely
of other
come
things
back, Rob.
that we can
This is
talk
fun.
about. I think that this conversation is an interesting one. I hope no one takes this and says that I'm trying to throw the entire book of Luke into doubt. But I will say, as a former believer, and probably this is how I literally took the Bible, right? But when I applied like the God's inspiration to this, it didn't leave room for me for some of the different mistakes, contradictions, and things like that. We'll talk about that another time. But listen, gentlemen, I really enjoyed this. I'm glad we got to do this, and looking forward to the next time.
And you said that, but man, okay, Matt, you can yell at me.
No, dude, if you want to go,
I really want to say something. That's all, Rob. I totally get where you're coming from.
Yeah.
I didn't grow up a Christian, so like, I have an outsider's perspective, I guess, on this a little bit in a weird way, because this is one of those things that I've noticed as somebody that wasn't a Christian his whole life, became a Christian later on in life. Is I see people that grew up in the kind of like IFB fundamentalist circles, and there's this, and I promise I'm not trying to be a jerk. If I come off as psychologizing you, it's the last thing I want to do. Okay, I'm serious. I'm very serious.
I'll admit it. It's culty.
But like there's this like leftover fundamentalism.
Yeah, you're importing it in.
That happens, and that's not me trying to invalidate your arguments or anything like that.
No.
Because like when you think of inspiration, I'm willing to bet you might be thinking like dictation, or maybe like as Paul's writing the text, like his eyes are rolling to the back of his head, and like God is channeling the words or something like that. Like
autonomous
when I think inspiration, I just think God is supervising the compilation and editing of the texts.
Yeah, I'll tell you this, because I totally get it. And a lot of times I hear people frame this as like divine inspiration versus divine authorship, right? Which are two different things. But the question I always come back to is, man, is this the word of God or not? Right? Because if it's the word of God, I don't care whether it was inspired, authored, dictated.
Right.
Like I hold a higher standard for a deity being involved in the writing of a book than I do for other areas where I may be apt to say, yeah, he made a mistake. It's okay.
Well, I'll just say this, and so before Matt punches me in the soul real quick, is two things, Rob. I really enjoyed talking with you. I love talking about this kind of stuff, and I'm sorry I wasn't as quick on my feet with some of the historical stuff. But two things is, one, I do think it is kind of you importing that. I don't think that it's wrong to necessarily hold God to a higher standard, but when I look at the Book of Acts and when I look at Luke Acts as a whole, I see, like I said, one of the most reliable historians in the first century that you could possibly find, for a number of different reasons. And I would love to talk to you about those sometimes. I do these on my own channel, Testify Apologetics. Feel free to join me on one of those at some point. Also, Dan and I work for a ministry called Talk About Doubts. We have people who are experts in this. So if you want to see if there's just like a rational path back to your faith, or even if you're resistant to that whole idea, like, I don't know about that, but I'd be willing to talk about it with somebody, and because I still am open to the evidence, then we could also just talk privately or publicly on this, and like,
I'm happy to continue this one,
like a whole hour and a half, and
publicly or
calls.
privately.
Yeah.
These call-in things are tough when you have fun, like good conversations, man. It's tough. So I know anytime too, Rob. Okay,
I can go for like 2 hours any day with you guys.
Oh,
and
I know.
I know we'd have a blast with it, even though we wouldn't see eye to eye. But I appreciate you guys having me on. A lot of fun tonight.
All right, catch you later, Rob.
Cool.
Good to
Thanks,
meet you,
guys.
man.